Hello and welcome to this special edition episode of Talking Blue. I'm Tom Connors and I'm joined by Tim Salmons of the Digital Bits. And today on this special episode, we're going to talk about the brand new Criterion Collection release of Night of the Living Dead, the original George A. Romero classic. We're going to discuss the film itself, the copyright issues, and the film's sequels. But before we do that, Tim is going to give you his review of the Blu-ray from thedigitalbits.com.
Night of the Living Dead is unquestionably one of the most important horror films ever made, and more so, one of the most important independent films ever made. While George A. Romero was initially reticent to return to the genre upon the film's unexpected success, he thankfully did, making more films in the Dead series, as well as other genre ventures. However, for certain fans and critics, Night of the Living Dead is George at his purest. A simple story about zombies, or ghouls as they were then known, coming back to life and surrounding a farmhouse full of mixed personalities, also served as a metaphor for human society, up to and including its gut punch of an ending. Eventually, Night of the Living Dead transformed into a full-blown socio-political statement, masquerading as a horror film, but from a small local group of amateur filmmakers. By modern standards, Night of the Living Dead is somewhat tame compared to what the zombie film and TV landscape ultimately became. But, for an 8-year-old who popped in a Media Home Entertainment VHS copy of the film, consequently having the wits scared out of him, I can safely say that the film affected me in a deep personal way, as it did many others. The inability of the film's human inhabitants to get along with each other and survive the night without being consumed is distressing, but not far from real-life truth. Not everyone manages to get along during a crisis, especially one in which they must work together closely. In this way, Night of the Living Dead serves an allegorical purpose as the outside force, in this case, flesh-eating zombies, is eager to take us over and literally devour us piece by piece, but not before we devour each other in the interim. Night of the Living Dead is also considered one of the original midnight movies, along with films like Eraserhead, El Topo, and the Rocky Horror Picture Show, amongst others. While you can certainly poke holes in the performances and the low-tech nature of the special effects, there's no denying how effective the film is in front of an audience. George would go on to soften the initial concept a little in Dawn of the Dead, subsequently reversing that softness in Day of the Dead, but Night of the Living Dead stands as an example of a fledgling filmmaker with something on his mind that was fully capable of realizing it in both an artistic and commercial way outside of the Hollywood system. A very long and overdue edition of the film on home video, which for years has been plagued with a variety of bottom-of-the-barrel VHS and DVD releases, only occasionally getting decent treatment through companies like Elite Entertainment, the Criterion Collection welcomes the film into their catalog with open arms and loving care. This release contains a brand new 4K digital restoration of the film from the original 35mm camera negative, also substituting certain pieces that couldn't be utilized with scans from a 1968 35mm fine-grain print. This restoration was carried out by the Museum of Modern Art and the Film Foundation, and was personally supervised by George before his passing, co-writer John Russo, sound engineer Gary Striner, and producer Russell Striner. There's no disputing this. Criterion's presentation of the film is the best the film has ever looked on home video, likely even during its original theatrical and drive-in run. It features thoroughly even and well-resolved grain, revealing high levels of fine detail previously hidden in substandard murky home video presentations. It's incredibly organic and film-like with deep, inky blacks, perfect grayscale, and top-of-the-line contrast and brightness levels. It's also entirely stable and clean, leaving behind no damage of any kind. In other words, this is a crisp, beautiful transfer. The audio is of the same caliber, which is featured in the film's original uncompressed English mono soundtrack with optional subtitles in English SDH. This track was also supervised by Romero and Gary Striner. It's an obviously narrow but extremely clean soundtrack with excellent dialogue reproduction and well-separated score and sound effects, leaving no leftover distortions. It's also much clearer and cleaner than ever before, with very good ambient activity, but no major hiss, crackle, or dropout issues whatsoever. For the extra selection, Criterion has done themselves proud. Not only does it draw upon many of the film's previous Laserdisc and DVD releases, but they have also included previously thought lost material as well. On Disc 1, which contains the film itself, there are 2 audio commentary options, both from 1994. One features Romero, co-writer-producer Carl Hardman, actor Marilyn Eastman, and co-writer John Russo. The other features producer-actor Russell Streiner, production manager Vincent Cervinsky, and actors Judith O'Dea, S. William Heinzman, Kira Shawn, and Keith Wayne. Also included is the never-before-seen Night of Anubis, which is a 16mm work print of the film, featuring an alternate opening title and a day-for-night ghoul shot that wound up being removed. While it's missing its second reel and is full of damage due to tape and cement splices on every cut, not to mention being presented with unrestored sound, it's a fascinating artifact that gives us a minor peek behind the curtain at how close the film was to its final version, even in this form. To complement this is Hands-On Horror, the Night of Anubis work print, which is an introduction to this version by Russell Streiner. On Disc 2, the bulk of the extra material can be found. This includes Light in the Darkness, a new video piece featuring filmmakers Frank Darabont, Guillermo del Toro, and Robert Rodriguez discussing the importance of the film and its influence. Yet another revelation, which is a set of silent 16mm dailies from the film, including some alternate takes, with an introduction by sound engineer Gary Striner, Learning from Scratch, The Latent Image and Night of the Living Dead, an interview with co-writer John Russo about the early days of the company and his experiences on the film, a VHS recording of silent B-roll 16mm film shot for Pittsburgh Broadcast News, which was saved by newscaster and actor Bill Chilly Billy Cardille, and is the only behind-the-scenes footage of the making of the film known to exist. Walking Like the Dead, a set of interviews that were shot for the 2009 documentary Autopsy of the Dead, with cast and crew members Ella Mae Smith, Charles Craig, Lee Hartman, Herbert Summer, William Mogish, David James, Regis Cervinsky, William Birchinall, Kira Shawn, and S. William Heinzman. Tones of Terror, the Night of the Living Dead score video essay, narrated by Jim Saranella, which delves into the film's use of library music. Limitations and Virtues, the Image-10 style, an excellent video essay by filmmakers Tony Zhao and Taylor Ramos from Every Frame a Painting. Excerpts from the 1979 episode of Tomorrow with Tom Snyder, featuring an interview with George and Don Coscarelli about the state of horror films at the time. George A. Romero, Higher Learning, a discussion about the film from the 2012 Toronto International Film Festival event, hosted and moderated by Colin Geddes. A previously available but extended 22-minute audio interview with Dwayne Jones that took place in 1987 and was conducted by journalist Tim Ferranti. An interview with Judith Riley that was produced by Elite Entertainment in 1994. A brief snippet of a 1967 newsreel detailing the real-life findings of the Mariner 5 Venus probe spacecraft in Venus's atmosphere, which prefigures the radiation-contaminated satellite that causes the dead to rise in the film. The original theatrical trailer from 1967, as well as the 2017 Genesis Films trailer. 2 TV spots, one lasting 20 seconds and the other lasting 60 seconds. 5 radio spots, one lasting 30 seconds and one lasting 60 seconds, both from 1968, and 3 from a 1970 re-release of the film. And last but not least, a fold-out paper insert with a poster on one side, and the film essay, Mere Anarchy is Loosed, by critic Stuart Clawins on the other side, as well as restoration details. Obviously, Criterion was not able to license every piece of extra material from the film's previous home video releases, but there are some notable absences. Missing from the Elite Entertainment Millennium Edition Laserdisc and DVD releases are the film's original script, all of the Latent Image commercials, an outtake from The Derelict featuring Carl Hardman, the parody film Night of the Living Dead, and an insert which contains liner notes by Stephen King. This release also contained a variety of stills from the production itself, advertising, posters, and props, but some of them, along with the commercials, are used in Criterion's various video essays, featurettes, and interviews. Also missing from the Dimension Genius Products DVD release is the long-form documentary One for the Fire, The Legacy of Night of the Living Dead. Speak to the Dead, a Q&A with George Romero from 2007 at the Bloor Cinema in Toronto, Canada, hosted by Stuart Andrews of Rue Morgue Radio, and an additional still gallery. Missing from the Umbrella Entertainment Blu-ray release is the Reflections of the Living Dead 80-minute documentary. And just for posterity, all of the extras from the fairly useless 1998 30th Anniversary DVD release, which primarily applied to that version of the film and not the original, aren't included either, which is for the best. There's also various DVD and Blu-ray releases from all over the world that seem to contain some exclusive extras, including other additional featurettes, and in one instance, a CD soundtrack. Also not present, whether it actually exists or not is up for speculation, but for several years, around 15 minutes worth of additional footage that was ultimately cut from the film was said to have been found. However, I personally believe that wound up being the dailies footage that's been included in this new release. Regardless, if you own any previous releases with any of these extras, it might be good to hang on to them if you're a fan and want absolutely everything. It's kind of remarkable that a group of people who primarily make commercials for a living were able to pull off a film that not only worked, but changed a part of the horror film landscape in general. Night of the Living Dead isn't a flawless film by any stretch of the imagination, but it has inspired many of us throughout our lives, whether we make films, write about them, or simply watch them. Sorely in need of royal treatment on home video for years, Criterion's release is a home run if ever there was one. It's one of the year's best releases by far, and it comes highly recommended.
So now that we heard Tim's review, which I have to say I'm impressed by the disc. I have never seen it look this good, and I imagine it looks better than it ever did before, probably.
Oh, absolutely. There's no other disc that can compare. For years, the only thing that was good enough was Elite Entertainment's Laserdisc and subsequent DVD release. Their transfer of it made the movie look better than it ever had, and that was the only time that was ever done, because everything before that, it was barely watchable. But this new restoration is the only thing that anybody's ever going to need from here on in.
Right. Well, unless they possibly release a 4K version of it, perhaps, since it was restored in 4K. But beyond that, this movie has been on home video probably more than any other movie in history, mainly because of a copyright issue, which we're going to talk a little bit about here. But first, it's worth bringing up that the movie was released on DVD 121 times to this point. Now, though, the film is technically copyrighted, or at least the 4K scan of it is.
Yes, the new 4K restoration that the Museum of Modern Art did is copywritten. You'll notice when the movie ends, there's a little copyright set of text at the bottom of the screen. And the reason for that is possibly to give George, and at the time that they were preparing this restoration, George hadn't passed yet. Basically, when this movie didn't have a copyright on it, that means he didn't make any money off of this movie. So, probably part of the reason for the copyright is to get hit. He could make some money off of this, but also no one else can use this restoration without MoMA's express permission, meaning that from here on in, if you buy Night of the Living Dead from any other company, it's going to be a substandard transfer. You're not going to get the quality of the Criterion release.
Right, and let's get into this a little bit, because I know, speaking of George, one thing that always kind of bothered him, but also was a blessing, was that the movie was accidentally not copyrighted. And to get into the logistics of what happened is the title changed from The Night of the Flesh Eaters to Night of the Anubis to Night of the Living Dead. So that's 3 different titles this film had, and at some point they forgot to put the copyright on the title, which at this time, that was the standard way of doing it. They had the title screen at the beginning, and you'd see the copyright generally in Roman numerals at the bottom. Regardless, that was the copyright, and that's the way the law worked at that time. Well, in the process of changing the title, someone forgot to do the copyright. So for well over 50 years almost, this movie was basically in the public domain, which allowed it to be showed at any theater royalty-free, on TV royalty-free. Video companies were free to release it on video royalty-free, and of course this led to the film being well known by the audience, but at the same time it led to a ton of really shitty releases out there, right?
Yeah, it led to a lot of different releases, and so much so. I was also talking about how the fact that George and the people that made it didn't make any money off of it. That's one of the reasons they remade it in the early '90s. It was a way to make some money off the movie, which they had never done. And I actually like that remake pretty well. I haven't seen it in a while, but I liked it a lot. I don't know if it's on par with the original, but it's pretty damned entertaining.
I think it's pretty well regarded, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I rather enjoy the remake. I don't have any issues with it. So yeah, needless to say, it was a really silly mistake that caused this minor copyright issue, but at the same time, we may not be talking about the film today if it wasn't for that copyright issue, and we may not have even gotten a bunch of sequels, which we're going to talk about here. The movie had an impact on the film landscape, not just in horror, but independent films. Isn't that right, Tim?
Absolutely. Many people credit George with being somebody as an inspiration when it comes to independent filmmaking. Even Kevin Smith mentioned something about it, that he always admired George and his independent spirit of making movies outside the Hollywood system, primarily in Pittsburgh.
Right, which is kind of what Kevin did for a long time, too, so I can see that influence there. It made a whole new genre onto itself with zombies, which now is a huge genre. Needless to say, there's been plenty of sequels, unofficial remakes, all this kind of stuff when it comes to Night of the Living Dead. And it's really hard to sift through all this stuff. So what we're going to give you now is a complete breakdown of what the actual George A. Romero Dead films consist of. So, of course, the actual films that are in Romero's true series, the 6 films include Night of the Living Dead, of course, then Dawn of the Dead, then Day of the Dead, then Land of the Dead, then Diary of the Dead, then Survival of the Dead. So let's talk about each one of these real quick. Dawn of the Dead is probably the most well-known of the sequels, right, Tim?
It's arguably the most popular outside of Night. It's the most fun of all the Dead movies that he ever made. Dario Argento gave him a call and asked him if he wanted to make a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, and they agreed that for George to come to Rome and to write the Dead sequel. And he had already had something in mind because he had visited the Monroeville Mall, and he had kind of an idea of, it would be really neat to kind of hold up in a place like that in case the apocalypse ever happened or something like that, But they made a deal that Dario would recut the movie for foreign distribution while George could do whatever he wanted with U.S. distribution. So that's what happened. And having such free reign, he could have made a really depressing movie, because a lot of his movies, like Night and Day, which we'll be talking about here in a little bit, are very much like that. They're very dark and dour, not always fun to watch. But Dawn of the Dead is one of those movies that you're always in the mood to watch. It's just a fun movie with an upbeat ending and a total 180 as compared to the first film.
Yeah, and I, of course, enjoy Dawn of the Dead quite a bit. And there was a remake of that directed by Zack Snyder a few years back, and that's actually pretty well regarded, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the original. And I think you're right. I think Romero was pretty much at his peak with this film, and he captured all kinds of social commentary while having a lot of fun with it, and a lot of fun with the zombie genre in general. And sure, some of the effects don't exactly age the best. This movie is a little difficult to come by in the United States right now due to some rights issues. I don't know how much you know about that.
Richard Rubenstein, the man who produced Dawn of the Dead, he's the one that owns the rights to both Dawn of the Dead and Martin, another George Romero movie. And what it is he's basically holding out for, who knows, a gargantuan amount of money to be able to license this for Blu-ray release in the United States. And yet that's the reason that it's being held up, is that Richard Rubenstein is just sitting on this, hoping that somebody will come along and basically, back a truckload of money up to his house.
And as much as a lot of us fans would love that to happen, and as much as we think the movie's worth that, it's not as popular as we'd like to think, to where
it's not likely.
Yeah, so there's that issue there. So unfortunately, that's one of the harder ones to come by in the US, but there was an Anchor Bay Blu-ray of it a few years back that was actually pretty decent, if I'm not mistaken. So that was really tough to come by, and that's only the theatrical version. I think it's the Italian release that I have, has all the movie versions of it, but it does not have all the same extras. So if you do happen to have basically the multi-disc version and that release, you're pretty well set to go. That's about the best way I think you could probably put the best version of a special edition for yourself together, probably, Tim, right?
Yeah, it might cost you a little extra. I actually don't know what that multi-disc DVD is going for these days.
So then there was a third film, and that was Day of the Dead. And this is actually my personal favorite, not just because of the whole, it's not as fun as Dawn of the Dead, but I think it has the best story, some of the best characters, some of the best effects, and it is very of its time as far as the social commentary goes as well. What do you think of Day of the Dead?
I love Day of the Dead. I actually saw Day of the Dead before I saw Dawn of the Dead, because at the time, Dawn of the Dead was out of print on DVD as far as I knew. And we're going back to the mid-1990s or so.
Right.
It was out of print on VHS and DVD at that time, until Anchor Bay re-released it in that big, massive multi-disc set. So they put out a nice special edition of Day of the Dead, and it was wonderful. A wonderful film. Not wonderful meaning that it was fun to watch, but just meaning that, wow, he really went for it, and he really went for the throat with this one in a way that harkened back to some of the things he was saying in Night of the Living Dead. And that movie is a very aggressive film. Even to this day, it still holds up pretty well. And you can trace the evolution of The Walking Dead all the way back to Day of the Dead. They resemble each other so much. That's a terrific film, and you were talking about the effects. I have never seen zombie effects since Day of the Dead that hold up quite as well as Day of the Dead does. The effects in Day of the Dead are amazing. And I believe Tom Savini won the Saturn Award that year.
I would not be surprised if. And just to note, that was 1985, so there was no digital anything at this point. This was all practical. And there is some really kick-ass. I mean, if you're a slasher fan, a fan of old school effects, and you have not seen Day of the Dead, do yourself a favor. And it is available. They did an Anchor Bay release a few years back, and there's also a more recent Shout Factory release. Now, I think the Shout Factory release is a little bit better for the extras, but I kind of lean more towards the Anchor Bay release for the picture and sound. That's just my personal preference, but what do you think on that one, Tim?
I don't know if anybody's ever gotten Day of the Dead right on home video. It's one of those ones that I can see getting a further restoration sometime in the future. But I think both of them look fine. I don't really have any preference on either one on extras or transfers. I think they both look just fine. The extras on the Shout Factory one versus the Anchor Bay release, they were fairly the same except for the main extra, which Perry Martin did a big documentary about Day of the Dead on the original Anchor Bay disc, and then I want to say it was Michael Felsher and Red Shirt Pictures that did the documentary for the Shout Factory release. And it's basically the same sort of retrospective documentary with a lot of the same people. They just happen to be a lot older.
Right, and of course, like I said, you can pick or choose, but you're going to have a little bit harder time finding the Anchor Bay release. So, but of course, if the only one you can find is the Shout release, it's definitely worth picking up. So then, though, speaking of Shout, there's also a release by Shout of our next movie we're going to talk about here, which come quite a few years after the last film, and that was Land of the Dead. So technically, we kind of skipped over the 90s. That was the one decade Romero really didn't get to comment on with a Dead movie outside of the remake of The Night of the Living Dead, so you could kind of count that one in there. But let's kind of talk about Land of the Dead, because I actually kind of like this one too quite a bit, and for a lot of the same reasons why I like Day of the Dead, and that is, the story, the cast, and the effects. There is some digital effects in here that probably don't hold up as well today, but they did do a lot of practical effects still, and I thought it was a lot of fun. What did you think of Land of the Dead, Tim?
I liked Land of the Dead a whole lot. I'm like you. I think it's flawed, but I don't think it's something to be overlooked. I think it holds up really well, and I think it ages really well. I think it's really underrated as far as his later movies. I don't think people gave that one a fair shake, because I think they were holding it up to some kind of expectation that just probably was never going to be fulfilled, which I don't really know what that expectation is. I went to the theaters and I saw it, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. And when I rewatched it when Scream Factory put the Blu-ray out, I was like, wow, this holds up remarkably well. And sad to say, it's just as timely a film as it was when it was released.
I think the one thing that really hurt the film at that time, and this is just a personal perspective, especially from working at a video store at that time, I think that between all the 28 Days zombie movies and Resident Evil zombie movies, I think people just kind of like, oh, how quaint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a glut of them there at one time. You have the 28 Days Later, 28 Weeks Later, you had the Dawn of the Dead remake, you had George's Land of the Dead. So you just had a whole bunch of zombie movies coming out, which in retrospect, if you look at that time frame, and then a few years later when everybody was making zombie something, it's pretty tame. So.
Oh yeah. If you get a chance to check that one out, do yourself a favor. John Leguizamo's great in it. Dennis Hopper.
Yeah. One last thing to say about Land of the Dead is that you also have to keep in mind while you're watching it that it's the only George Romero zombie movie that he ever made that he made through a studio system.
Well, that's
all
right.
The rest of them are independently made. So, there were some stipulations that they had to have, which was it had to be R-rated. That was a contractual stipulation. He'd be able to release an unrated version of it later, but also it had to have some familiar faces. So it had John Leguizamo, it had Ozzy Argento, and Simon Baker, I believe, was the lead in that movie. So, and Dennis Hopper as well. So you kind of have to look at it through that kind of prism. You can't just look at it through the prism of like a wild, crazy filmmaker that goes out and makes one of these crazy zombie movies. You have to realize that, hey, he was working for a studio and this was the only way he could get the movie made at the time. So you have to kind of cut it a break.
Oh yeah, because I remember him talking about trying to get Dead Reckoning, which was the original title, made for a very long time. Yeah. So then moving on, though, I'm not too familiar with these next few titles because I have not had the chance to see them. Diary of the Dead, and that was a found footage film. I think if I remember right, it was done independently, like you said, and then released through Dimension, if I'm not mistaken, on home video.
Yeah, Dimension released Diary and Survival. I did see Diary, and I saw it once. I don't remember a thing about it, which is not to remark on its quality at all, but I don't remember anything about it, and sometimes that's a sign of a movie that just is not that effective. But I've been eager to revisit it and check out Survival, because I hear from various people that like Land of the Dead, you should give his other movies a fair shake as well. But I don't know, we'll see at some point down the road.
Right. I'd like to give at least Survival a chance. I haven't had a chance to yet, but Diary, I can't say that I've really gone out of my way because I'm not a big fan of found footage films. So, but I will give that a shot one of these days when I get a chance. If it pops up and I have a chance to watch it, yeah. I'll definitely take a chance, or if I find it real cheap on Blu-ray or something like that, I might snag it up. But those are all the Romero films then as far as the Dead films go. Sadly, he ended at 6, but that's a nice round number as far as a series goes, and you kind of even add in the Night of the Living Dead remake as we brought up.
Twilight Time released it in the US, and it completely sold out because, Twilight Time is a company that only does 3,000 units per title, and they underestimated how much this title was going to sell. And not only that, but they also did a new Sony did a new transfer of it. And in the process, they actually talked to the DP over the phone, and the DP had told them that he would like them to have changed the brightness and the color of the opening, 10 to 15 minutes of the movie. And so when the movie came out on Blu-ray through Twilight Time, a lot of people just cried foul because, it looks so dramatically different than it did previously. But fortunately, if you buy the Umbrella disc, it doesn't have that. It's not the same quality Sony restoration, but it does look like it always has since it was released on video.
Yeah, so if you get a chance to check that one out, go for it. And, of course, check out any of the movies we talk about. Let us know what you think about them down in the comments. And I want to thank Tim for his time, and always check out the Digital Bits for his latest reviews. Isn't that right?
That's right. You'll at least once a day we have a new review. We try to anyways, so please check us out.
That's right. New films, old films, all the above, just like the review you heard at the beginning of this video. So once again, I want to thank Tim, and I want to thank you guys for listening and joining us here on Talking Blue.
If you like this video, then please hit that subscribe button. Due to recent changes made by YouTube, we also encourage all of our subscribers, both new and old, to please hit that bell icon next to the subscribe button as well, so you will be notified when new videos are uploaded. Be sure to check back for news and analysis of the happenings and corporate politics behind the scenes of your favorite genre movies, as well as explorations of your favorite characters and their backgrounds and context here at Midnight's Edge.